moment to imagine yourself in a picturesque New England village. The wood-paneled, stoic colonial homes that dot the quaint streets, the sugar maple and stark white elms bow in a gentle spring breeze. It's one of the most contentious times in American history, as the rest of the country teeters on the brink of a bloody civil war that will cost nearly 500,000 lives before it's over. But none of that discord reaches here, though. It's quiet and serene, and while the stain of national conflict doesn't mar this particular town, it's a stain of a whole other kind that will eventually make it infamous, because it is the birthplace of America's first acclaimed serial killer. Herman Webster Mudgett was born in Gilmanton, New Hampshire on May 16, 1861. His parents, Levi Horton Mudgett and Theodate Page Price, were independently wealthy and both directly descended from the first English immigrants in the area. Mudgett had an older sister named Ellen, an older brother named Henry, and a younger sister named Mary. His father worked as a farmer, trader, and even a house painter, and he and his wife were devout Methodists, insisting all of the children meticulously completed their religious studies. His parents were very strict, instilling in Mudgett a hard-working, ambitious attitude, as well as a drive to learn. The young Herman was shy and timid, small for his age, and often found himself the target of bullies. There were accounts of bullying when he was a child, as his classmates were quite jealous of how well Mudgett did in school. When his classmates discovered he had a fear of doctors, they dragged him, kicking and screaming, to the town doctor's office and forced him to stand in front of a human skeleton. Mudgett was, of course, afraid at first, citing that the skeleton seemed to have its arms outstretched, reaching out for him. Later in life, he mentioned that this experience exercised his fears and, quite ironically, was the spark that began his unhealthy obsession with death. At the age of 16, he graduated from high school and took several teaching jobs in Gilmanton and the nearby town of Alton. On July 4, 1878, Herman married Clara Loverling in Alton. The couple had a son, Robert Loverling Mudgett, born on February 3, 1880. In an attempt to continue his education, Mudgett enrolled at the University of Vermont. However, he didn't find the school much to his liking. He left after only 1 year and instead enrolled in the University of Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery in 1882. While enrolled, he worked in the anatomy lab under Professor Herdman, the chief anatomy instructor. He had also apprenticed with Dr. Nahum White, an advocate of human dissection. Later in his life, he admitted to stealing several cadavers from the lab at this time, disfiguring them and trying to claim that they had died in accidents in an attempt to collect insurance money. But we will hear much more about his con artistry later. In 1884, he had graduated, which is one thing that sets him apart from most serial killers. He furthered his education and finished medical school. Typically, serial killers tend not to finish their higher education because the educational system tends to bore them to the point that they drop out or fail out of their classes. Think Ted Bundy. He never finished law school. While his academic life was fruitful, his personal life was beginning to show cracks in the proverbial armor. Eyewitnesses claimed that they saw Mudgett treat Clara rather violently, and it got to the point where she moved back to New Hampshire shortly before his graduation, claiming that she heard very little of him after that. Mudgett's character began to slowly change from mild-mannered intellectual to a man that was followed by trouble everywhere he went. After graduation, he moved from state to state, working various jobs such as an asylum attendant, pharmacist, and doctor. With every passing state and every different job, Mudgett was steadily honing his craft, perfecting his con artistry, and preparing himself for a life of crime. In 1886, to elude former acquaintances who had tried intervening to put a stop to his acts, he changed his name to Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, and thus H. Holmes was born. During this time, Holmes relocated to Chicago to practice pharmacy. though there may have been an even more practical and sinister motivation for the move. Likely a larger city provided not only more opportunities for obscurity amongst the huddled masses, but also a larger pool of victims. Among his earliest victims were those that would follow a distinct pattern in Holmes's life: vulnerable women. He had married Clara back in 1878, but discontent with a solid married life, he went on the road to enter into shady real estate and promotional deals. While visiting Minneapolis, he met and married Myrta Z. Belknap, with whom he would eventually have a daughter. He was still married to Clara at the time, making Holmes a bigamist. He had filed for divorce from Clara, but didn't have the follow-through to ensure that the paperwork was finalized. The small family of 3, with Myrta, Holmes, and their daughter, lived in the upscale suburb of Wilmette, even though Holmes barely spent any time at home. He preferred to spend his time in the city tending to his business. And that business enterprise, set amid the background of the World's Fair in 1893, once revealed to the horrified public, would go on to shock the world. While living in Chicago, Holmes would happen across E.S. Holton's drugstore, located at the corner of Wallace and 63rd in the neighborhood of Englewood. Dr. Holton was ailing from cancer and left the day-to-day business of the pharmacy to his wife. Through his endless well of charm, Holmes would get a job at the drugstore and would persuade Holton's wife to allow him to purchase the store from her. The agreement that they came to was that Holton's wife could still maintain her upstairs apartments on the property even after her husband's death. Once Holton did pass away, Holmes seemed to conveniently forget the details of the arrangement and would turn his attention instead to tying up loose ends, especially any loose ends who might be able to contest his ownership of the building. It was around this time that Holmes would kill Mrs. Holton and then fabricated the story that she had gone to California to visit relatives. Once questions began being raised regarding her extended absence, Holmes changed the narrative to claim that instead she loved it so much in California that she decided to live there permanently. Mrs. Holton was the first victim to be claimed by Holmes and his soon-to-be infamously called Murder Castle, but she would be far from the last. In 1889, a trip to Indiana had been profitable, and Holmes had made use of the journey to pull off an insurance swindle with an accomplice named Benjamin Peitzel. His accomplice would eventually earn himself jail time for the swindle, but Holmes would come away from the affair unscathed. Over the next 3 years, Holmes would select primarily female victims, lovers, hotel guests, even some of his own employees, one of which was the wife of his employee, Ned Connor. He arrived to operate the jewelry counter, which Holmes had added to his drugstore, with his wife, Julia, and their daughter, Pearl. They would also move into a small apartment above the shop. It wasn't long, though, until Julia had caught Holmes's eye. Divorced from his second wife, who claimed he had tried to poison her when she confronted him about being still married to the first, Holmes wasted no time in swooping in and quickly separating Julia from her husband. The two began an affair, and, luckily for Ned's health, he ultimately decided not to fight Holmes and instead moved on, abandoning his wife and child to their new benefactor. Though there is little doubt, if Ned Connor truly knew the fate he'd be leaving them to, he would have acted much differently. Holmes ultimately sought financial gain. It was a pattern he followed his entire adult life, and it would be the thing that would ultimately be the undoing of his entire criminal enterprise. But for the time being, fraudulent insurance claims, followed by untimely deaths, were the order of the day, especially for the women in his life. He would take out life insurance policies on his intended victims, paying the premiums for them, but making himself the beneficiary of the policy. Once the financial payout was assured, his victims would then find themselves casualties to Holmes's wicked, ensnaring web. Julia Connor and her daughter Pearl would have large insurance policies taken out on them once her husband was out of the picture. There was even evidence later that Julia had been complicit in many of Holmes's schemes and swindles. Holmes would then use the ill-gotten money to purchase an empty lot across the street from the drugstore, where he would begin to construct his sinister magnum opus, a 3-story block-long building. The locals dubbed the monstrous edifice a castle, and they were far from exaggerating. The ground floor contained, along with Holmes's own relocated drugstore, a jeweler, and various other shops. The second and third floors contained office spaces, including Holmes's personal office, as well as a labyrinthian maze of more than 100 windowless rooms. Once inside these halls, the building ceased to be a castle, and instead morphed into more of a terrifying carnival funhouse. Some doors would open into dead-end brick walls or staircases that led nowhere. Oddly angled hallways and soundproof rooms that could only be opened from the outside were also among the constructed oddities that the strange castle held in its walls. No one from the outside could understand the purpose of the design apart from Holmes himself, and he would take extensive precautions to guarantee that his plans for the building would remain a secret. He changed builders constantly during the process of construction. Some crews would be brought in solely to install a basement with a huge furnace before they would be let go, and another crew would be brought on board to construct a different section. The advantage of this shell game was twofold for Holmes. Firstly, it made certain that no crew knew all of the secrets to his building. This would decrease the chances of crews becoming suspicious and going to the authorities. It also ensured Holmes would be able to duck creditors or elude paying for certain things by claiming he was not satisfied when the work was complete and that he would bring on another crew to finish the job. The left hand would never know what the right hand was doing. And all the better for Holmes, who was about to bring his vision to life. The castle was finally completed in 1891. Set against the perfect backdrop of the Columbian Exposition World's Fair to take place in 1893, where a stunning white artificial city was being constructed in Jackson Park to celebrate and laud the innovations of the new modern world. In the background, another building loomed much larger than life, and this one would be no monument to progress, but instead a monument to murder. The castle would advertise itself through classified ads as a hotel and boarding house space to accommodate tourists traveling to Chicago to visit the World's Fair. But much like the fabled Hotel California, guests would check in and never check out. They would be subjected to torture before their death. After all, Holmes hadn't constructed the various puzzling rooms and corridors inside the castle for nothing. Some victims would find themselves locked in soundproof rooms fitted with gas lines that allowed for slow asphyxiation at Holmes's whim. Others would find themselves locked inside a large bank vault near his office. There, he could imagine their screams in panic, crying out in desperation as they searched for a way out before slowly suffocating. But none of their tormented sounds would reach the outside, as the vault had also been carefully soundproofed. Scratches and claw marks were later found on the walls of these sealed rooms, mute testimony to the sheer terror and panic that these victims endured in their final moments. But death wouldn't be the final chapter, or even the final word for his victims. No, it was a mere semicolon, a break in the measure. The bodies would be escorted to secret chutes in the walls that led to the basement, which had already been outfitted for the next phase of his plan. Holmes had managed to even turn death into industry. The bodies would be dissected, stripped of flesh, and crafted into articulated skeleton models that would be sold back to medical schools. Through connections he maintained after attending medical school himself, he could sell these reassembled skeletons and organs with little suspicion. Upon discovery of his crimes, an investigation was launched at the site of the infamous murder castle, which discovered the true scope of the post-mortem disassembly line that Holmes had at his disposal. Located in the basement were 2 large furnaces capable in size of easily accommodating an adult human being, along with bottles of various poisons which lined the walls. There was a vat of acid and a pit of lime, so when necessity demanded a quicker disposal of the bodies, he would cremate some of his victims or place them in the vat or pit, respectively, for complete dissolution. But just when you think that would be the zenith for this carnival of terrors, Holmes, ever the ringmaster, would draw back the bloody curtains for one last exhibition. He would choose one of the more remote rooms in the upstairs offices to perform hundreds of illegal abortions. Many of the frightened women who came to seek out his services did not survive the risky procedure and would be added to the collection of bodies below in the basement, their skeletons and organs processed and sold along with the other victims. Incredibly, Holmes was able to keep this murder operation secret for 4 years. He slaughtered an unknown number of women, many whom had not only come to visit the fair but never returned home from their trip, but also others who had made the mistake of answering Holmes's various false advertisements. He ran ads for employment opportunities for his various businesses, as well as personal ads where he lauded himself a wealthy bachelor seeking a wife, all for the almighty dollar, the next windfall. And that came in the form of a young woman named Minnie Williams. Williams was in Chicago working as an instructor for a private school. Holmes introduced himself to her as Harry Gordon, one of his many aliases, a wealthy inventor. His interest in the young lady was piqued when he discovered that she was the heir to a Texas real estate fortune. They were soon engaged to be married. None of that sat well with Julia Connor, with whom Holmes was still involved. Not long after the engagement, Julia and Pearl went missing. When Ned Connor inquired as to their whereabouts, Holmes dismissed their concerns by saying they had moved to Michigan. In his later confessions, Holmes would claim that Julia died during a botched abortion he was performing on her, and that he poisoned little Pearl. He admitted to murdering the mother and child because of Julia's jealousy towards Minnie Williams, and while that may have been so, Julia had committed one further cardinal sin to Holmes. Quote, "I would have gotten rid of her anyway," he said. "I was tired of her." Unquote. Minnie Williams would live at the castle for more than a year. Much like Julia Connor, authorities assumed that due to her closeness to Holmes, there was no way she could have been oblivious to the crimes occurring right under her prim and proper nose. Besides being the driving force behind the deaths of Julia and Pearl Connor, she is also thought to have instigated the death of 17-year-old Emily Van Tassel. Emily took an offer of employment to work in the candy shop on the first floor of the castle and at some point caught Holmes's eye, which upset Minnie. Emily vanished after a month of employment. There was also Emmeline Sigrand, who worked as a stenographer at the Keeley Institute in Dwight, Illinois. Holmes's old criminal accomplice, Benjamin Peitzel, had been there to take a drunkenness cure and had told his former partner all about the young girl's beauty. Holmes reached out to her right away to offer her a job. She accepted the offer and came to the castle, but would never leave it. Sigrand became homesick after a few weeks of working for Holmes and wished to go home to visit her family and her fiancé, Robert E. Phelps. This could not be allowed. Holmes later confessed to locking Emmeline in one of the soundproof rooms and sexually assaulting her. He then stated that he killed her because of Minnie Williams' objections to him lusting after the young ingenue. Sometime later, Robert Phelps made the grave mistake of dropping by the castle to inquire after his lost lady love. It was the last time Phelps was reported to have been seen alive. Holmes would later describe a stretching experiment which he employed to kill Phelps. Holmes had always admitted to a curious fascination as to how much punishment a human body could withstand, He often used his dissection table on still living victims, after all. In a curious throwback to the torturous dungeons of medieval times, Holmes had concocted his own rack-like device that would stretch a human body to its breaking point. It was there that Robert Phelps would meet his untimely end and be reunited with his fiancée in death. In April of 1893, Minnie Williams' property in Texas was deeded to a man named Benton T. Lyman, a man with a strange name who didn't exist. Benton Lyman was, in fact, Holmes's accomplice, Ben Peitzel. Later that same year, Minnie's brother was killed in a mining accident in Colorado that was said to have been arranged by Holmes. The next month, Holmes and Williams, now presenting themselves as husband and wife, rented an apartment in Chicago's Lincoln Park. Minnie's sister Nanny came to visit in June. This is where the details get fuzzy. According to Holmes, Minnie killed her sister in a heated argument by hitting her over the head with a chair. He said he then disposed of the body to protect her, but the truth likely lies elsewhere. Other accounts claim that Nanny was locked in the vault and tortured until she signed everything she owned over to Holmes, who then disposed of her. A short time later, Minnie wrote to her aunt that she would be leaving with Brother Harry to travel Europe. By then, Holmes was already in a position to take Minnie's land inheritance, and her will left everything to Holmes's personal assistant, Ben Peitzel. It would seem she had outlived her usefulness to him, even as an accomplice. Whatever the end the sisters ultimately came to, Holmes no doubt had a hand in it. Neither of the Williams sisters were seen alive again after July 5, 1893. Neither of their bodies were ever recovered.
The sight was disgusting, yet when I looked upon it and realized that at least $20,000 would come to me after a little further trouble, I gazed on it as a very good investment which was about to mature.
By the summer of 1894, Holmes was on the run. Creditors were closing in, and insurance companies had come knocking, threatening to prosecute him for charges of arson. He fled Chicago and reappeared in Fort Worth, Texas, where he had inherited the property from the ill-fated Williams sisters. It was here, the intersection of modern-day Commerce and 2nd Street, where he sought to construct another castle like the one in Chicago. But he soon abandoned the project, finding the law enforcement environment in Texas inhospitable. Holmes and Ben Peitzel were traveling together now, leaving Peitzel's family safely behind while the pair continued to run cons wherever they traveled, always in pursuit of the next windfall. Earlier in the year, Holmes had purchased several railroad cars of horses with counterfeit banknotes. He signed on to the sale under one of his many aliases, then proceeded to ship the horses to St. Louis where they were sold. He would make a tidy profit, but it was this scam that would come back months later to bite him. Most of this time, Holmes and Peitzel were also accompanied by Holmes's third wife, Georgiana Yoke, a rich girl with a tarnished reputation who had an inheritance coming to her left by a departed uncle. Georgiana, described as a lovely blonde with eyes that seemed almost too big, nearly like a defect, seemed oblivious to her husband's motives, even as they traveled the country, scamming the whole way. Holmes's freedom didn't last long, though. He was finally arrested in July for the fraudulent sale of the horses in St. Louis. Fraud was nothing new to Holmes, and he'd made a habit of it wherever his travels took him. However, it was this charge that got him incarcerated for the first time. He wasn't in jail long, but he'd been in long enough to strike up a conversation with a convict named Marion Hedgepath. He was serving a 25-year sentence for train robbery. Holmes, who was never short on ideas for fraudulent get-rich-quick schemes, had come up with a doozy. He concocted a plan to swindle an insurance company out of $10,000 after taking a life insurance policy out on himself, then faking his own death. This wasn't the first time that Holmes had toyed with this idea. It had been years ago, back when he was still in college, that he'd first proposed the idea to his classmates. Only a pipe dream then. It was about to become a reality. In exchange for the name of a lawyer who could be trusted to join the scheme, Holmes offered Hedgepath a portion of the incoming windfall. Hedgepath directed Holmes to a St. Louis lawyer named Jephthah Howe. Howe, who was in practice with his older brother Alphonse, thought the scheme brilliant. The bottom quickly fell out of the plan, though, when the insurance company became suspicious of Holmes's claim and refused payment. Rather than press on with the issue, Holmes enlisted the help of a trusted cohort, the ever-faithful Benjamin Pitezel. Pitezel then agreed to be the body in Holmes's fraudulent master plan. A second attempt of the scheme was carefully concocted and was set to play out thusly. Pitezel would set himself up as an inventor in Philadelphia under the false name of B.F. Perry. He was then to be accidentally killed and disfigured in a tragic lab explosion. Holmes would then find an appropriate cadaver to fill in for Pitezel. His background as a doctor and a chemist left him with more than sufficient knowledge of where to easily acquire a body, as well as how to disfigure it with chemicals to make it unrecognizable. The $10,000 claim would then be paid based on the discovery of the body of the concocted B.F. Perry. The money would then be split evenly between all concerned parties, everyone going their separate ways with enough cash to keep them going for a good while. That is not how things happened for the unfortunate Pitezel. Instead of obtaining a body the way he was supposed to, Holmes knocked Pitezel unconscious with chloroform. He then used benzene, a highly flammable chemical, to set Benjamin Pitezel's body on fire.
At last I forced myself to burn the clothing upon one side of the body, smoldering the flames when they reached the flesh, and in this way produced partially successful results.
Holmes implied that Pitezel was still alive when he set the fire, but forensic evidence would later show that the chloroform had been administered after Pitezel's painful death, likely to fake a claim of suicide and exonerate Holmes should he be charged with murder. Always the consummate conman, it was likely that he intended to kill Pitezel from the beginning rather than split another share of the money. The fewer the conspirators, the larger the share at the end. Not to mention the fact that Pitezel's alcoholism had run rampant in the past year, and Holmes worried that the many secrets that Pitezel knew about Holmes's crimes and schemes would easily slip out of drunken lips. Either way, Benjamin Pitezel, while once a close confidant and crony of Holmes, had now become a liability, and, much like everyone else who dared to get close to H. Holmes, had outlived his usefulness. Holmes would collect the insurance payout with the help of the genuine Pitezel corpse. He would then persuade Pitezel's unsuspecting wife into allowing 3 of her 5 children to be taken into his custody. It wouldn't have been difficult to persuade Carrie Pitezel. After all, Holmes had known the family for a good while at this point and had become quite close to them over the past few years. Alice would first accompany Holmes to identify her father's body. She would be kept away from her mother from then on. Afterwards, the Pitezel children, Alice, Nellie, and Howard, would find themselves sequestered with their new benefactor in boarding houses along a long trip through the northern United States and into Canada. At the same time, Mrs. Pitezel was being escorted by Holmes on a parallel route. Holmes continued to lie to her about the whereabouts of her deceased husband. He claimed that Benjamin was hiding out in New York, as well as the whereabouts of her missing children. Mrs. Pitezel would be kept at a cunning distance by Holmes for reasons which are unclear, as he already had the money from the senior Pitezel's death and had no insurance claim on any of the Pitezel children. In Detroit, just before crossing the border into Canada, mother and children would be only a few blocks apart, unbeknownst to each other. Alice, the eldest of the missing Pitezel children, would write to her mother regularly in hopes that they would be reunited soon, as Holmes kept claiming they would be. But his true plans were far more sinister. The letters would go unanswered, and Mrs. Peitzel would never see her children alive again.
Little Nellie followed me to the door and said, "Don't forget about baby," and reaching up, kissed me goodbye and ran back to the seat again. With all truthfulness, I most earnestly state that under the circumstances, and at this time, about 4:30 p.m., Thursday, October 25th, I last saw these children.
Holmes would initially swear of his innocence in his memoir, claiming he left the children alive and had no idea what became of them after that. Later, before his execution, he would admit to murdering the girls, Alice and Nellie, by forcing them inside a large trunk and locking them in. He drilled a hole in the lid and put a hose down into the hole, the other end of which was attached to a gas line, a familiar form of execution for Holmes, reminiscent of his days at the castle when he used gas to asphyxiate helpless guests. The same fate would befall Alice and Nellie. Holmes then buried their nude bodies in the cellar of the home he was renting at 16 Vincent Street in Toronto. The bodies would be discovered by Detective Frank Geyer, a Pinkerton detective out of Philadelphia who'd been assigned to investigate Holmes and to locate the missing children. Geyer wrote of the discovery, quote, "The deeper we dug, the more horrible the odor became, and when we reached a depth of 3 feet, we discovered what appeared to be the bone of the forearm of a human being," unquote. Meanwhile, Holmes was long gone with the one remaining Peitzel child, Howard. His flight took them to Indianapolis, where he rented a cottage. It was the last place Howard Peitzel would be seen. According to reports at the time, Holmes visited a local pharmacy and purchased drugs that he used to kill the small boy. He then dismembered the child before burning his remains. Geyer would follow Holmes's trail to the rented cottage, but Holmes had yet again escaped the intrepid detective's grasp. However, bits of teeth and bone, believed to be the only remains of little Howard Peitzel, were discovered in the Holmes chimney. The authorities were closing in on Holmes's trail, though. And why, you might ask? Well, simply because of a loose end that he forgot to tie up. You see, he never paid Marion Hedgepath the money promised to him from the original insurance scheme. So, out of spite for being double-crossed, the felon tipped off the police of Holmes's schemes. The murderous escapade of lies and death came to an end in November of 1894, when Holmes was finally apprehended in Boston after being trailed there by the famed Pinkerton Detective Agency. Likely, he was in Boston preparing to flee the country. He had left Georgiana behind at her parents' home in Indiana. Carrie Peitzel was located in Burlington, Vermont, in a small house that Holmes had rented for her to await the arrival of her family. Holmes had stayed at the home with her for several days before storming out angrily after being questioned by the widow over a large hole he was digging in the backyard. The police would later come to believe that Holmes intended to kill Mrs. Peitzel and bury her at the home, but for some reason did not go through with it. She was luckier than the rest of her family and many others who crossed paths with H. Holmes. But despite his ultimate arrest after leading Pinkerton detectives on a cat and mouse chase across the country, the authorities had a problem. There was a distinct lack of physical evidence for the crimes, and Holmes wasn't admitting to anything. All the authorities had were their suspicions of wrongdoing for the time being, so to keep Holmes incarcerated while they searched for more evidence, he was held on an outstanding warrant for horse theft in Texas. Meanwhile, the custodian of the murder castle informed the authorities that they had never been allowed to clean the upper floors, which seemed highly suspect to the Chicago police. They began to conduct a thorough investigation of the building over the next month, and the maze of strange rooms, death chambers, and macabre details of dispatching varied victims would splash luridly across headlines and inflame the imagination of the public. The most damning evidence of all was discovered in the basement, where police would find the skeletal remains of both humans and animals, soiled women's undergarments, and a wooden operating table stained with dried blood. Dozens of human bones and several pieces of jewelry were found and could be traced to Holmes' mistresses. A wood-burning stove in the center of the basement contained scraps of cloth, and Ned Connor was summoned to the castle to identify a bloody dress that had belonged to Julia. In a hole in the middle of the floor, more bones were found. After being examined by a physician, they were believed to be the bones of a small child between the ages of 6 and 8. The fate of Pearl Connor was now finally also known. No complete remains were found during the excavation of the basement, but suffice to say that it was apparent, even from the scant pieces left behind, that this had been quite a massive operation. The true number of victims taken by Holmes in his castle will never be known, though based on the sheer amount of remains that were found, authorities believe the number to be much higher than the 27 that Holmes would later admit to. Some estimates put the number as high as 200 victims. On July 20th, some city workers began excavating the cellar and started a tunnel underneath 63rd Street. A hazy smell of gas hung in the air, and as the men tore away one wall, they discovered a large tank of sorts. As soon as they broke through, the basement was filled with the stench of death, driving the crew back. Noting the metal lining of the tank, they sent for a plumber, and he struck a match to peer inside of it. Suddenly, the tank exploded, shaking the building and sending flames out into the basement. The men were buried in piles of debris, but no one was seriously injured. The tank was lined with wood and metal and was 14 feet long. Although thanks to damage caused by the explosion, no one will ever know what it was truly used for. The only clue in the room was a small box that was found at its center. When it was opened by Fire Marshal James Kenyon, an evil-smelling vapor rushed out. The gathered men ran, except for Kenyon, who was overpowered by the stench. According to the New York World, quote, "He was dragged out and carried upstairs, and for 2 hours acted like one demented," unquote. Following the excavation and the discovery and the cataloging of Holmes's potential victims, the murder castle sat empty for several months. Not surprisingly, it drew onlookers and curiosity seekers from all over the city. The people of Chicago were stunned that such terrible things could take place in their illustrious hometown. The people of the Englewood neighborhood observed the gawking sightseers with a combination of fear and loathing, disgusted by the lurid events that brought the crowds to their streets. And while this seemed to be the final curtain call for the castle, the actual denouement was about to play out. On August 19th, the murder castle mysteriously burned to the ground. 3 separate explosions thundered through the neighborhood just after midnight, and minutes later, a violent blaze erupted from the abandoned structure. In less than an hour, the roof had caved in, and the walls began to collapse in on themselves. In a clear act of arson, a gas can was discovered amongst the smoldering ruins, and rumors flew as to who had done it. Theories bounced back and forth between an accomplice to Holmes burning down the house to hide their role in the horror, and the arson being committed by an outraged neighbor. The mystery was never solved, but regardless, the castle and the evil that it stood for was gone for good. All the while, a small, unassuming man sat in a Philadelphia jail cell, waiting to stand trial. The authorities in Philadelphia had begun to try to unravel the whole of the Peitzel situation, especially the fate of the 3 missing children who had been last seen in Holmes's company. Holmes himself gave several conflicting accounts of the children's whereabouts, first claiming that they were hiding out with their father, then that they were in the company of another accomplice, but seemed unwilling to part with the truth. Besides, the attention he was getting while locked away wasn't all bad. Frank Geyer's quest to find the darlings of the nation was as highly publicized as the search of Holmes's castle. His discovery of their gruesome fates and their discarded remains sealed Holmes's fate, at least in the mind of the public. Geyer would write of the tragic end of his mission of discovery, quote, All the toil, all the weary days and weeks of travel, toil and travel in the hottest months of the year, alternating between faith and hope and discouragement and despair, all were recompensed in that one moment." Unquote. Henry Howard Holmes, a.k.a. Herman Webster Mudgett, was put on trial for the murder of Benjamin Pitezel and summarily confessed, but only to fraud. He insisted that Benjamin Pitezel had committed suicide and that he was innocent in the deaths of the 3 Pitezel children. In true narcissistic sociopathic fashion, believing that he knew the case better than anyone, Holmes would dismiss his attorney, who was charged with defending him, and, instead, in a mirror of Ted Bundy some 84 years later, would defend himself in court against the charges of murder. Witness after witness would attest to the fact that it would have been impossible for Benjamin Pitezel to commit suicide. The case quickly took a downturn, and Holmes, now desperate, brought his lawyers back into the courtroom, still swearing to his innocence. The mounds of evidence brought forth in the case made the jury ultimately think otherwise. Following his conviction for this crime, he would confess to 27 murders total in Chicago, Indianapolis, and Toronto, along with 6 attempted murders. The weight of the truth in the confession must be weighed against the very real fact that the Hearst papers paid $7,500 at the time for his confession. Holmes gave contradictory details and accounts of his life, initially proclaiming innocence, then backtracking to say that he believed himself to be inherently evil from birth. His facility and talent for roguery, as Geary would put it, and for being a consummate con man makes it difficult to determine what, if any, truth can be gleaned from his statements. Whatever the case, it made no difference in the sentence. Judge Arnold would impose a death sentence that Holmes would be hanged by the neck until he was dead. And on May 7, 1896, the sentence was carried out at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia. Until the moment of his death, Holmes remained calm and amiable, even charming, as he quipped, quote, "Take your time, old man," to the executioner, whose hands were trembling. The black hood was placed and the trapdoor opened, and Holmes quickly dropped. And in a final twist of what many may call karmic justice, while the force of the initial fall had broken his neck and the rope had been pulled so tight that it had become embedded in his flesh, his heart continued to beat for nearly 15 minutes. His fingers clenched and feet danced for several minutes after the fall, a gruesome sight which caused many witnesses who had flocked to the prison that day to see the devil get his due to turn away in horror. With such a violent end, many speculated that even after his burial, Holmes's spirit refused to rest, and the strange string of macabre incidents that occurred not long after his death might give an observer pause. Dr. William K. Matten, a coroner's physician who had been a major witness at the trial, suddenly dropped dead of sepsis. Dr. Ashbridge, the head coroner, and the trial judge who had sentenced Holmes to death would die next in rapid order. Both were diagnosed with sudden and previously unknown deadly illnesses. Next, the superintendent of the prison where Holmes had been incarcerated committed suicide. The reason was never known. The father of one of Holmes's victims was horribly burned in a gas explosion, and the remarkably robust and healthy Detective Frank Geyer suddenly became ill. Not long after, the office of the claims manager for the insurance company that Holmes had swindled out of money caught fire and burned. Everything in the office was destroyed, save for a framed copy of Holmes's arrest warrant and 2 portraits of the killer. And the strange incidents kept coming. Several weeks after the hanging, one of the clergy who had prayed with Holmes before his execution was found dead in the yard behind his church. The coroner ruled death as uremic poisoning, but according to contemporary reports, he had been badly beaten and robbed. A few days following his mysterious death, Linford Biles, the jury foreman, was electrocuted in a bizarre accident involving the wires above his house. In the years that followed, others who had crossed paths with Holmes met violent deaths. Patrick Quinlan, the custodian of the murder castle, would commit suicide by drinking strychnine. His family claimed he was haunted for months before his death and could not sleep. Finally, Marion Hedgepath, the train robber who had turned Holmes into the authorities, had been granted a pardon for his cooperation. But his luck would run out on New Year's Eve 1910, when he and his gang were trying to rob a saloon. As he was stuffing money into a burlap sack, a police officer wandered into the place, unrelated to the robbery, and shot him. Hedgepath was killed instantly. So, it turns out, Holmes was right about one thing after all.
I was born with the devil in me. I could not help that I was a murderer, no more than the poet can help the inspiration to sing. I was born with the evil one standing as my sponsor beside the bed where I was ushered into the world, and he has been with me since.
Was H.H. Holmes indeed America's first serial killer, as is claimed? Perhaps. Holmes himself claimed to have killed 27 people in his final confession, and some accounts of his crimes pushed the estimates into the hundreds. Unfortunately, there is no way to tell the truth of this for certain. But there are 10 definite deaths linked directly to Holmes. Mrs. Holton, Julia Connor and her daughter Pearl, Minnie and Nanny Williams, Emmeline Segrand, and that of Benjamin Peitzel and his unfortunate children. And that, along with many of the strange remains and inexplicable rooms encountered at the murder castle itself, lend to a definite air of suspicion that surrounds Holmes to this day.